All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome to this special Evo Security webinar. My name is Mike Roth. I'm the CEO and founder here at Evo Security. And today we are honored to have a true pioneer in the world of identity and access management joining us, Eve Mailer. She is the inventor of SAML, which, as many of you might know, is the kind of underpinning of modern day single sign-on. And she's a renowned expert in identity standards and security architecture. I think her contributions have shaped the way that we approach identity and access management collectively as an industry and as technicians. Whether you're an MSP looking to strengthen your identity practices, or you're just curious about, what does the future of identity look like? What is identity? I think you're in for an insightful discussion. So Eve, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a great pleasure to join you here today, Mike.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think for me, when you really start to peel it back and you think about, wow, like you've had such an amazing contribution to the world of identity and access management with, you sort of had this journey that you went on and you were saying, okay, here's this problem that's unfolding in front of me. It's big and we need to figure out how to solve it. I think that's just so fascinating. You think about the millions of authentications that are happening every single day. And a lot of that is a result of your work. And so I would just love to hear your story and your journey. How did you get started and what led you to that place?
Sure. Well, obviously, especially when it comes to standards, it's a group project. It's kind of a community thing.
Yeah.
And I was involved in creating XML, the extensible markup language, which started to become favored for kind of machine-to-machine communications. And I had joined Sun Microsystems, and there was a new topic being discussed at the time, web services. And a colleague and I were looking at this going, oh my goodness, this is really going to need security. We need to somehow be part of the solution. And it seemed like XML was being bandied about as part of the, the solution for like how systems could communicate with each other. And so I ended up being at the table of a discussion that looked like standardizing authentication services, essentially, like turning it into a shared service. When we started the group that became SAML, notice it doesn't have an I in it. So SAML is security assertion markup language. It doesn't say identity anywhere. We didn't really think of things as identity then. We thought of it as security and kind of directory, like, LDAP directories.
Yeah.
And at that table, I was kind of the newbie. I was the XML expert they were bringing in to help create a protocol, create a standard. And so this was back in the year 2000. Things were really pretty early along, but we ended up solving a problem, cross-domain single sign-on, which got very associated with this concept of identity and access management ultimately, that turned out to be a really big problem that needed to be solved. So standards are hard. You never know if you're going to really succeed with it because you're asking multiple parties to change their behavior all at once, kind of in coordination. But SAML was, I think, important enough to solving key problems that it unlocked a lot of value for a lot of different businesses.
That's amazing. So when you were looking at this problem, how many people were involved in total? And then how did you say, okay, here's XML, and now we're going to this security assertion markup language methodology. And then you're thinking to yourself, okay, that means that everyone who's building a web service of some kind, and not web application, has to adopt this, and then they need to go build it. And there are different variations on how you could actually go about doing that. How deep did you go? And the reason I asked the question is because if you're an MSP technician today, you're thinking, okay, well, I encounter certain web applications that use XML, or, I have to copy and paste a string or do something like this. And then others, a little bit more simplistic. Some of them, you just upload a file, it's all there. And so when you were looking at all that, how did it evolve, and where did you sort of draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we built it, it's good enough, this is going to work, but I don't know how we make it any better from here. Let's see how the community adopts this.
Well, in truth, I was still a little bit new to the standards world. I had had some experiences, didn't know how this was really going to go. But by 2001, early 2002, we had a V1 of SAML. And we picked a pretty modest kind of MVP, if you will, something we could just sort of get started with, which was what is known in SAML as IDP initiated single sign-on. So some user kind of logs into, let's say, their employer website, and then that employer works with, let's say, like a benefits provider, a 401k provider or something like that, where you could sort of be sent over to that external party and get logged into them automatically because you already logged in as an employee. That was a key kind of initial use case. So we were modest in our initial ambitions, but I still thought as soon as we published the spec, well, okay, it's there. Everybody go use it. And that's not really the way the world works. It takes time. There's technology refresh cycles. But the thing that we solved initially, right in that stage before we went on to a V2 and, added capabilities was how to, as I call it, fling identity information securely and reliably across the internet, which is kind of a scary thing to do, is to say, look, Joe Smith logged in at this time using this method. I want you to trust that I'm telling you that he did this. It's kind of a big deal to outsource authentication services. But what it ended up doing, because there were so many businesses, particularly small businesses, who wanted to get started using all these SaaS tools, SAML really enabled the rise of cloud identity, where you could have SaaS web apps used by some business that didn't have to be responsible for authentication necessarily, could outsource it. And for a small business, didn't have to lay in a lot of supply of physical footprint of stuff in order to get started. So that's what I kind of think SAML had this great opportunity to unlock. And by 2005, I was starting to see numbers where business SaaS providers were adopting SAML. It was north of 50% by then. And, companies like Okta started and Microsoft started adopting SAML. And it started to become kind of, more in the realm of you can't get fired for using SAML, which was a very good thing for businesses that wanted to be efficient, especially when they didn't have a lot of resources.
Yeah. Gosh, that's so fascinating. And it's interesting to see how fast you mentioned adoption, getting over 50%. And we've seen other standards that have been created and they don't have the adoption rates. Why do you think that is? What are some of the, as you reflect upon this particular happenstance, why do you think that SAML got the adoption, whereas maybe something like OIDC, but we now have WebAuthn and passkeys that are emerging? Was it just timing? Was it just, right size solution at the right time? What do you think it was?
I will say OpenID Connect has, it's got quite a lot of adoption, particularly if you've got a green field, and it solves some slightly different problems than SAML does. I think they coexist quite nicely for different purposes. Things like passkeys, it's so nascent. The rest of that story hasn't been written yet, and I'm excited to see what happens. But there's definitely standards. Some of them I've come up with, some of them I've been involved in that, just haven't been adopted to that level. And there is a kind of network effect that you rely on for standards to really have the full flowering of their value. Because what they're doing is they're strategically commoditizing something so that you can build value on top. So I think SAML was, it was in what I think of as the first era of identity standards. So it had the advantage of, being one of a very small list of things that was being worked on. XACTML, which is the extensible access control markup language, has not really seen quite that level of success. Perhaps because the problem it's solving is it's more subtle. It's got kind of a smaller base of those who are interested in it. It's more involved in the application semantics of what you're trying to do, which is like authorization policy, act on that policy, versus authentication, where everybody can kind of agree the semantics are all the same. You want to know how strongly they were authenticated and, who they are. And that's kind of the basics. And so it was an easier job to solve, I guess. We didn't know when we started it, just, how easy or hard it would be or what the adoption would be. But we boldly went and did a thing and it turned out to work okay. But yeah, so some standards, we're in a new era. I think of this as the third era really of standards, because we've got kind of the SAML era. We've got the OAuth stack era, which has been a very productive and interesting time. And we're in this kind of third era where there's really a lot of, maybe too many standards being worked on.
What do you think? I'll ask you one more question about SAML, since again, because the impact's been so large. And then I'd love to just kind of broaden the discussion to identity and IAM at large, but what do you think are the common misconceptions about SAML that still persist today? I think about if I'm a smaller organization and someone says that, hey, you have these web apps that you're using for your business. And some of those companies, let's just think of like the 5 or 10 most common companies out there. Companies 1 through 3, they might say, hey, in order for you to use SAML or single sign-on to log into our application, which is a convenience to you, we're going to charge you extra on dollar per user per month. Others, they say, hey, you know what? It's free. Like, this is just the standard that we need to have in the world. And then there's something in between. So if I'm a small to medium business, I might think to myself, wow, this is a really sophisticated piece of technology. I don't really know what it means. They're upcharging me for it. Or do I actually really need this then? Or can I just use like the native MFA on that web application where I just, kind of scan the QR code, and I might have 50 keys in my authenticator app on my phone, but yeah, who cares, whatever. Maybe if you could kind of help think and talk through that, like, what do you think the misconceptions are and some of the things we need to do to continue to push in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, one of the, I suppose, myths is, well, it's fiddly and sophisticated and kind of too rich for our blood. And it's really unfortunate about those companies that do upcharge. In fact, there's a site, you're probably aware of it, called SSOtax.org,
Yeah.
which is going to call out these companies that are upcharging if you connect single sign-on through SAML. Remarkably, there's just so many of these SaaS products that do have SAML support. They really have to have it. I also think it's inappropriate to make that be the kind of next tier of service. It's a good idea to use because you don't want to have to be responsible for more of that kind of strong authentication path than you're really prepared to own. And SAML paired with strong auth of the right sort is immensely valuable. It's immensely important because if you have single sign-on and all you're doing is protecting services with a password, you're now enabling kind of propagation and lateral movement of bad guys who have stolen the credentials. So it's really important to pair single sign-on with strong auth and being able to rely on an external identity provider, or even just an identity provider that you've sort of sequestered in your organization of whatever size, so that you've got the single source of truth for identities, is so powerful. So I think it really is a misconception that, SAML is something that you should put off. I also think that there's some sense that I think is incorrect that somehow SAML is irrelevant in this age of the OAuth stack and OpenID Connect and social sign-in. I really think that it's still highly relevant because it tends to use cases like this IDP-initiated single sign-on that OpenID Connect can't do. It's optimized for a lot of web app subtleties. And OpenID Connect kind of has a specialty around mobile apps, which is another order of magnitude of attention that things, need to have. So I really feel like SAML is optimized for a lot of business and specifically business to business use cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's a really good segue into, because you had some really good architectural comments in there, in addition to some practical application and how to just think through single sign-on and things reasonably. Because inevitably, if you're a technician or you run an MSP, you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I just solve this problem? How do I just solve it at scale? I don't really have these major complex things that I need to go do. But one of the questions that I've been posing to the MSP community recently is to just kind of take a step back. You say, okay, yeah, we have this MFA stuff we need to do on endpoints. We have to solve the web authentication problem. So we're going to use SAML, OIDC to the extent realistic or practical, perhaps a passkey. Even though, to your point, that's nascent. And then there's this whole other slew of privileged access that kind of gets rolled up underneath the IAM acronym. And so when you take a step back and you say, IAM, all this stuff has gotten rolled into it, what's your definition of it? How do you define it? what do you, when someone says identity, what comes to mind to you personally, given your depth of experience?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I hear even folks who are, steeped in IT saying, well, that's my login box. And I'm here to tell you, IAM is not just a login box. It's as many folks out there, many vendors out there will say, it's the first pillar of zero trust, which I think everybody has heard about by now. So it's really the front line of zero trust, of fraud mitigation, of handling payment, because you got to know who you're dealing with, and really access enablement for applications, not just access control. So I consider IAM to have this extent that includes all of the elements of runtime access control and all the elements of user management, including kind of the lifecycle management. And that's just taken as a whole, it's really powerful. And as we move to things that are passwordless and phishing resistant, I really think we got to rethink the whole login box equivalence anyway, because sometimes you don't have one.
Some pretty important recognitions there that when someone says IAM or identity, it's not just the login box. And I think that's been a common misconception in my experience is, what I've seen at different MSPs, and they say, hey, we need to go solve the MFA problem. All right, so we're going to go sprinkle some MFA on these machines. And then, we need to solve the SSO problem. And let's go do some SSO stuff. And then, we have some remote access, which is another question I'd love to dive into here. And then we've got these other network devices, and it just becomes, and by the way, we have technicians that have keys to the kingdom, and we need to control their privileges. And then we have end users on machines, and we need to control their privileges and all of this stuff. And you start to have this sprawl where you're starting to figure out, like, how do I solve like 5 or 6 different problems that are all interrelated because they're all rooted in identity. You need to know the identity of the user, the identity of the machine, the identity of the devices. And it all kind of comes back to the user store and the source of truth. And which is why one of the reasons I've mentioned, hey, look, identity, to your point, is the pillar or the foundation or the under kind of the fabric of zero trust. You cannot have zero trust without thinking of identity. So in your experience, when you've worked with companies that are really large and then others that maybe aren't so large, how have you thought through identity as a program versus a series of projects? And as a caveat, sometimes you just have to think of it as a series of projects because you're solving a specific thing. But what's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you might have phases, you might have individual projects, but what you're describing as the kind of one by one approach, let's throw some MFA on this. I really think of it as kind of app by app user management or security, or, you're redoing it over and over and you have no visibility across whether there's risks that you're adding to allow for lateral movement, to allow for, there's leakage that you're allowing for. So it's messy, it's inefficient. It's certainly contributing to insecurity when you do it that way. So taking a more programmatic approach where you account for, let's say, onboarding of users or registration, if you're talking about maybe customers of your company, and you're accounting for any identity verification you might need to do, and you're accounting for ongoing authentication of the correct strength for what they're accessing. And if you really have to beat down friction in those user journeys where somebody has to go and authenticate, there's lots of tricks that you can do if you've got a programmatic IAM approach to designing sort of step-up authentication where it's needed in response to risk, for example, and then looking at the life cycles of those users and knowing that you've got the full extent of those users not coming from multiple disconnected repositories, but you've got a single source of truth. So an IAM program is really all of those things, and you get a lot of that thinking for free because IAM architecture is a well-known thing. So taking advantage of kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, if you will, like security kind of doesn't stay still. There's all kinds of new threats all the time. Do I have to bring up AI? One of the latest sources of vulnerability, but so you have to keep up with things. And it's good to know that with this programmatic approach, then you've got tools available to you developed by specialists who keep up with the latest in strong auth, the latest in dynamic access authorization, the latest in fraud detection. Like, why wouldn't you want those to be sort of seamlessly included in your posture?
That's a really good insight. I think you mentioned step-up authentication and other things too, and it's just it goes to show that if you don't have that single source of truth or that single repository, and you're tying that into all the other decision making that an identity solution or platform or whatever it is starts to, I guess, effectuate for you, then now you start to have sprawl. And I think that's kind of one of the things I wanted to get into next is, as an MSP, often the challenges that they face is trying to convey that value of identity. And it's easy to think as technicians and as practitioners, and we say, hey, the science makes sense to us. Like we're like, okay, well, we can weave all this stuff together. We can make it work. But then you go to your customer and you're like, hey, look, you are a, let's say, auto franchise, for example, or something. You might be a small to medium business. And you go to this company and you say, hey, I need you to do this thing, this thing, this thing, and this thing now. It's going to add a ton of friction to your day. You're going to love it. It's going to be amazing. But it's so valuable. In your experience, how have you seen, single sign-on is obviously a friction reducer in many ways, but how have you seen other companies and some messaging around that might be useful for MSPs to kind of take away?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to talk about how you can sort of parcel out all the different values that IAM brings. I have a little bit of a story though, this example of something like, an auto dealership or let's say an insurance broker or somebody like that who, is just trying to make sense of their, relatively small business compared to the kind of behemoth partner that they have in the automotive manufacturer, the insurance company, whatever it might be. And SAML actually put some thought into this in the beginning, right? Because there's identity providers and then there's what they call service providers. These are relying parties. Oftentimes you're having to use some piece of kit because your big partner requires it of you. And so early on, we realized that, well, IDPs, identity providers, have a lot of resources. They're big enterprises. Those service providers, there's going to be many of them and they're going to be smaller. And this is when I was at Sun Microsystems. We actually developed a solution that we called the Fedlet to help these smaller parties federate to the big guys. And now I did not make the Fedlet. However, I named the Fedlet. At the time, applets were very popular. So, so anyway, there's tools available to these smaller parties to make sure that they can integrate seamlessly with some of these bigger partners. So to the topic of communicating the value of IAM, I think of it as having three centers. The first is to reduce risk. The history of all this technology comes straight out of cybersecurity. The second is to reduce cost, which is more of like a straight kind of IT question mark. The third is to actually increase revenue. You might say, oh, come on, you're talking about some real back office stuff. How can that increase revenue? So let me give a little bit more detail how that can be the case. You can simplify account creation. Now, if it's customer accounts or if it's accounts for, somebody, the salesperson you just hired who needs to be enabled to use all the applications that, any kind of modern business has, you definitely want to do that faster and more accurately. You can ease user journeys. You can actually make it simpler for somebody to get through to the data, to the app that they need to do their job. And if you're using it for customer identity, well, it's the thing that enables you to see everything that customer does and not to have that app by app kind of approach. So that's increasing revenue. A little bit color on risk. I mean, almost goes without saying these days, but yeah, you want to reduce breaches. You want to reduce any fines you might have. You want to reduce fraud. And the question of reducing cost, there's cost in having information spread all over the place and missing something. There's cost if you've got somebody that you've brought on board to do coding, integration, something, those can be costly parts of the business. So if that just comes as a package, if it comes as a turnkey way of doing things, you can definitely reduce the cost there. So I see those three centers, the value of IAM.
That's very insightful. Yeah, I think oftentimes in my experience, IAM is viewed as more of a cost center. And because you say, okay, I have to go do this for my IT staff. I have to go do this for my end users. And therefore, I'm not really thinking about a way where I can pass along these costs to our customers in sort of a reselling capacity, but also in the ways that you just mentioned, where it's like, look, every action you take has a cost assigned to it, right? And so, and it could be defined in many different ways. So, um, well, I wanted to ask another question here. This might be a little bit more kind of broader topic for you, but as someone who's played a really foundational role in this market and in this industry, what are some of the lessons that you've learned, and you can take this whichever direction you want, that you think others could benefit from? And I think the context here is more of like, you're a business owner, you're an MSP business owner, you're building your company, and you really want to do this right. You want to think about this correctly, or maybe you're just it's more enterprise, your IT staff, your practitioner, and so what are some of the things that in your various roles that you've learned that you think others could really benefit from?
Sure. So, I mean, one of them is it turned out single sign-on can be really powerful, and I do think it is an enabler. It must be, as I said, paired with strong auth. You got to go there. And the good news is that in the last couple of decades, we've made a lot of progress around not making that experience totally awful. There's, the entire passwordless movement is getting us in a direction to not have to compromise between security and experience. It's long been said, it's a trade-off. And I think some of those trade-offs are really softening and some of them are actually going away. So commit, I would say, commit to both. Second lesson that I've learned is something really admirable about kind of the cybersecurity world. Security is a team sport because security never stands still. Bad guys are definitely, taking every advantage. We talk about it being an arms race. You can use community to stay on top of new threats and new solutions that can make it sort of cheaper and easier for you to put them in place. And then finally, access control is, as I've been kind of suggesting, it's as much about business enablement. It's about what you can get through to do as it is about risk reduction. So you can unlock getting things done. You can unlock customers going and buying things safely while mitigating the security risk, the fraud risk that you're concerned about.
Awesome. And you mentioned some future state there around passwordless and stuff, which leads me to my next question. Where do you see identity going from here? We have this interesting time right now where we have traditional, quote unquote, traditional identity technologies that are still around, that are still very much so a large part of the way things are done today. And then there's this new future state that is emerging of passwordless, biometrics, of all sorts of really advanced technologies. And it feels to me right now that we're kind of like, we're seeing some patterns emerge. There's some definitive pathways that are kind of opening up for people, bigger adoption. But what do you foresee? Are we in a transitional state for a while, or do you think the future is going to hit us fast?
There's a lot to be said for the maybe traditional technologies going up through the kind of federated identity era, the single sign-on infused solutions. They're rock solid by now, and they're there for people to leverage. And I think that they're going to be leveraged for a long time. And I will say, nothing that's been deployed ever goes away. So some people have said, oh, SAML is dead. No, I don't think it's ever going to die, right? It's going to be there for us when we need it. You're talking a little bit about these digital identity wallets, and it's a very different paradigm. And it's been worked on for, nearly 10 years now in various guises. It started as this exploration of blockchain identity, and it's kind of moved along into more of a decentralized onto our personal devices kind of mode. And people will be familiar, if you use an Android device or if you use an Apple device, you've got wallets available to you that are serving things out that have to do with identity information, right? It's not just payments. It's not just boarding passes. They're starting to do like mobile driver's licenses and such. I personally believe that we're kind of in the wallet singularity right now. Like we cannot predict exactly how it's going to come out. There are many ambitions that I would say the decentralized identity community has. This is where a lot of these standards are coming from, many new standards. And, there's privacy ambitions and security ambitions and all kinds of, compliance ambitions. And I personally believe we might be a little bit disappointed in how many privacy ambitions will actually be realized from all of this. I've done some research on this recently. I have a paper called Consent is Dead, where I talk about some of the impacts of this technology. But I think anybody involved in the chain that involves travel or cross-border travel, particularly, or things that interact with mobile driver's licenses, I think that we are going to start to see some impacts over the next year or so. Worldwide, there's different movements that are pushing this, and different regulations, by the way. So I think we're going to start to see some of this used more, but it's not going to look like how people have been predicting, is my guess. And so talking about passkeys and passwordless more broadly, I think that this is actually quite productive direction. And I think that where we're seeing it now is primarily among retailers who find it easy to connect embedded finance. It's very available to small and medium businesses, and it's being made easy to deploy because it's connecting through the payments and finance rails, essentially. And I'm quite excited about that because I think it's really helping. Like, even if there still is a password behind that account, so the password could be stolen, could be used to, do an account takeover. Once you stop sending that password over the wire, then you're in a much better position. You're giving people passwordless experiences, which is way better than password-full experiences. It'll just get better and better. And you're reducing the attack surface for compromising those credentials. So I'm really excited about how far passkeys and the passwordless modality will take us. Yeah. So there's a few thoughts.
Cool. Yeah, I'm personally fascinated by this kind of mixed bag of efforts that people are going to have to make for a little while. And, I remember when AI and blockchain and everything was a big buzz, and, blockchain was going to change the world and stuff. And there's been some really interesting applications of that, but it seems like AI in general has kind of taken front and center over what we would call decentralization or blockchain. So it's kind of interesting to see how that's now coming back around in this new way.
Yeah, I think there's been sort of like, if you want to be buzzword compliant, a couple of years ago, it was still blockchain, and then it sort of switched to AI. And that put biometrics into question. And I think that there's a lot of innovation going on among biometrics vendors right now to come up with new methods of liveness detection, which is kind of the, you don't have secrets so much in biometrics, but you do have liveness detection, and it's very fiddly because it depends on the sensors and the processors used to, for example, look at your face and interpret your face. So there's a lot of exciting innovation that I think is helping the good guys make progress in that arms race.
Yeah, I have a question there for you around biometrics, because I've thought about this. Actually, I went to RSA a couple of years ago, and there was a white hat hacker, ethical hacker. She was up there presenting, and she actually live hacked Microsoft's Windows Hello biometric authentication mechanism, whereby she simulated a heat signature in addition to the image, where she actually found and simulated that data and then, I guess, injected it somehow. And then Microsoft authenticated a fake data person.
Yes.
Which perhaps they fixed that. But in the world of deepfakes and biometrics and other things like that, now this is getting in front of things for an MSP. How should they be thinking about those challenges legitimately and the validation of biometrics in the future?
Yeah, I bet that was Rachel Toback, right? She's amazing.
I think it was. Yeah, she was fantastic. Yeah.
I've seen her at the RSA conference before. And for audience listeners here who have not experienced the 40,000 person experience that the RSA conference is, it's quite overwhelming. And she's amazing. So this kind of injection attack where you're basically taking over the feed and feeding in other data versus what should be fed in to the interpretation engine of the face, of the movements of the person. This is a constant battle, and the good guys are getting a lot better at it. The thing to do is understand that this is a specialty. I've been saying security doesn't stand still. you kind of want to take advantage of all the new thinking. And the best way to do that is through leveraging a platform that has access to those capabilities, right? Through its own integrations. It's really the best way. Doing it on your own is just not, it's not even a question, right? Particularly for an SMB. You want to just know that you've got the latest tools kind of in your toolbox as provided by a partner. So, but yeah, biometrics are tricky in exactly that way. And it really kind of hits you where you live when biometrics get compromised, right? I actually have written another paper on authentication kind of versus AI and where we are now, with some advice actually even for families, figuring out like if you get a call from, a child or a parent supposedly in the middle of the night asking for money, how and when and where to be suspicious and apply your suspicions. This is the world we live in now.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time, I think, over the next 10 years, because you've got all these traditional technologies that you're trying to support, but then all this really advanced problems are emerging. And so I could just sense this period of time that we're entering where we're kind of our heads on a bit of a swivel, and we're like, okay, how do we defend against this? How do we legitimize? Like, what is the definition of authentication at that point in time? Like, how does it gets a little fuzzy, right? And so we have these binary systems that are trying to actually execute an authentication and give us confidence that we're doing our jobs as an MSP or as an IT team, but then we're faced with all these challenges. I think that's going to be a really interesting time. So, well, Eve, thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise with us today. This has been, I think, an invaluable conversation. I hope that if you're an MSP, if you're a technician, or if you're on an IT team at an enterprise, I hope that this session has provided some clarity and some inspiration, and that you've learned something new. And Eve, thank you so much again. Really a true honor to have the ability to spend some time with you today. And thank you for your contributions to this industry.
Well, thanks. The honor truly is all mine. Thanks.